Alone, alone about a dreadful wood, of conscious evil runs a lost mankind, dreading to find its father lest it find the goodness it has dreaded is not good. Alone, alone about our dreadful wood. Where is that law for which we broke our own? Where now that justice for which flesh resigned her hereditary right to passion, mind, his will to absolute power? Gone, gone. Where is that law for which we broke our own? The pilgrim way has led to the abyss. Was it to meet such grinning evidence we left our richly odored ignorance? Was the triumphant answer to be this? The pilgrim way has led to the abyss. We who must die demand a miracle. How could the eternal do a temporal act, the infinite become a finite fact? Nothing can save us that is possible. We who must die demand a miracle.
So we are in the season of Advent. If you're new to Advent, welcome. It's dark. So Advent is not about opening up little doors and getting a little piece of candy so we can count down the days of Christmas. Advent is all about hope. But I feel like before I can launch into a sermon about hope, I have to talk about some misideas, some terrible definitions of hope. See, I think hope is often mistaken for something like wishful thinking. I hope I win the lottery. Never going to happen, but like it would be nice, right? I hope someone would swipe right. I don't know, is that how y'all do that on those things? I hope that something that's not true would somehow become true, like some sort of wish that I have in my heart, right? So this is one idea of hope, that this is not what we mean when we talk about the Christian hope. So a second one is like this idea that hope is just like a positive outlook. That it's like, finding the good around you. It's the silver linings. And there's no limit to the number of influencers telling you to manifest your good life with good vibes. If I ever say anything like that to you, feel free to punch me directly in the throat. Because life is filled with all sorts of not good vibes. And life is filled with all sorts of things that we ought to pay attention to that are dark and hard and problematic. And so no, the Christian hope is not about just having a positive outlook, ignoring the negative things and only looking at the positive things. I like the Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann's definition of hope. It's a little lengthy, but go with me here. He says, hope on the one hand is an absurdity that's too embarrassing to speak about. For it flies in the face of all those claims we have been told are facts. It is the refusal to accept the reading of reality, which is the majority opinion. On the other hand, hope is subversive, for it limits the grandiose pretension of the present, daring to announce that the present, to which we've all made commitments, is now called into question. If you like it better, I'll give you J.R.R. Tolkien's more succinct picture of hope. Hope is the lived out expectation that the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ means that one day everything sad will come untrue. I think if we were to summarize our gospel reading this morning, it would be that Jesus is trying to break through all the noise, trying to break through the clutter, trying to break through Mariah Carey to tell you that there is lots in this world worth being sad about. I imagine there's lots in your world that's worth being sad about. But that God has not left you, God has not abandoned you, God has not forsaken you, that God is not giving you his best life for you now, that you don't have to be necessarily satisfied with what is, that there is something more coming for you. And so Advent is all about hope, because Advent is about acknowledging all that we still need God to do for us. It sits firmly and honestly in the present, and it doesn't pretend. It's one of the reasons I love Advent so much, as someone who is often wearing just black clothes. Side note, my daughter said we were getting a dress for her birthday this year. And we were like, hey, what kind of dress do you want? You pick any dress you want. She said, I want a black dress. I was like, yes, that's my girl. And if you know Zoe, you know how out of character it is for her to have chosen a black dress. So I was the father win moment there. But if we're willing to go with Advent here to the dark place, if we're willing to go into the grief, if we're willing to do like the hard and painful thing that so many of us don't really want to do, which is just to acknowledge all the things that are so broken and wrong with the world and with our own lives, what we gain is a robust hope. It's not like a thin, sort of flitting on the surface, sort of, it's really not that bad, it could always be worse sort of hope. But a hope that's filled to the brim with all of your fears and doubts and angst and even, yes, your pain. See, Advent is honest about things. Advent embraces an election that didn't go your way. Advent embraces and acknowledges your career that you feel like has stalled out, your marriage that feels like it's on the brink, the diagnosis that has no cure that you just received. Advent does not look away from a life that feels like it's lost all meaning to you. Advent throws us headlong into all of these things, and it does not shy away from or hide the fact that so many of us are facing right now in this room infertility, divorce, financial hardship, unemployment, grief, loss, and even death. Disappointment, dissatisfaction, regret, dismay, despondency, grief. These are all part of the human condition, and they're all readily welcomed into the space that is Advent. And I want to acknowledge for those of us that feel this morning, for those of you that drug yourself to church this morning, maybe drug yourself out of bed this morning, that the internal ache, the longing that you have for something more is sacred and is holy. Do not let anyone shame you for that. It's okay to be in pain. It's okay to cry. It's okay to grieve. Because we are all carrying around within us, if we've lived life long enough, the pain of the reality that life is hard and is often painful. And this is Advent's starting place. It begins in darkness, as one of my favorite authors, Fleming Rutledge, says. It begins in our need. And it's from this place that the gospel reading today from Luke reminds us of Jesus' teaching. Now, if you grew up in the sorts of churches that I grew up in, today's passage was a familiar one. This cataclysmic end of the world that's depicted by Jesus. And for many of us, we were taught this in this realm of fear. That look, the world is going to come undone, and you'd better be on the right side of things instead of on the wrong side of things, or else. And yet, when we look at Luke and what he's actually doing with this passage, what's really surprising is he's not leveraging this as fear against the early church. It's actually quite the opposite. This is meant to be an encouraging thing. And so let's see what Jesus says here. Picking up in Luke chapter 21 and verse 25, Jesus says, there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars. Side note, for those of y'all who are Bible nerds, some people will say, well, what Jesus is really just talking about here is the destruction of the temple. This is not the end of the world. This is not like the revelation-y, apocalyptic sort of thing that sometimes people say it is. Really, he's just saying, look, in 70 AD, the Romans are going to come in, they're going to destroy the temple, and everything that you think you know about religion and God and all of these things is going to come to an end. Well, that works for like verses 10 through 24. But when you get to verse 25, the problem is Jesus starts throwing in this cosmic language where he's not talking about Jerusalem anymore, and he's not talking about the temple anymore. He seems to be talking about all of creation. And so he says, look, there's going to be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and on the earth there will be distress among the nations, and perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting from fear and the expectation of the things that are coming upon the world, for the powers of heaven themselves will be shaken. Now, I don't know about y'all, but for me personally, in my own internal psyche, that sounds a lot like the year circa 2020 to 2024, right? Remember we had like vampire wasps or something like that at one point in the midst of the pandemic, half of Australia burned. And here, just even in the last several weeks, I've had so many of you come up to me and share, like, I just don't know what's next. I don't know what the next 4 years mean for me personally. There's real, legitimate fear. What's going to happen? We can zoom out even more, and we can see that the world in so many different places is broken and fractured with war in Ukraine continuing. A conflict ongoing in Gaza where an ongoing humanitarian crisis continues to unfold with no end in sight. The world is profoundly broken. And I think part of our problem is we think we can hop on our smartphones, go to Twitter, and fix it. If you'll just listen to my 127 character advice, all will be well. See, what Luke is doing here is he's not attempting to scare you. His point here, he's not recording this because it's like, hey, you better look out. The world's going to be destroyed. So mind your P's and Q's. He's trying to reassure you. See, here's what's going on. The church that Luke is writing to, so Luke writes his gospel somewhere between 70 to 90 AD. It's very likely that when Luke sits down and puts pen to papyrus, that the temple has in fact already been destroyed. That an entire generation of Christians has already come and almost gone, and Christ has still not returned. That the early church, who's expecting that Jesus is going to show up any day, waits for days and weeks and months and years, and nothing seems to change. All the while, their friends, their loved ones, their families are being torn apart by persecution. And so what begins to seep into the early church's imagination of what Christ is doing for them and for the world is, wait a second, where is God? Maybe we've hitched our wagon to the wrong horse here, if I can go back to my FFA days. And they even began to see the ongoing evil as a sign of God's rejection of them, God's curse upon them, God's abandonment of them. When the world keeps being the world, we should not be shocked. I don't think what Luke's point here is to warn you, hey, watch out, one day the world's going to be the world. I think what Luke's point here is to say, hey, the world is going to keep doing the world's thing. It's going to war, and it's going to be racist, and it's going to marginalize people, and it's going to murder, and it's going to steal, and it's going to destroy. But even in the face of all of that, I'm with you. And so as weeks and months and years went by for the early church, they began to lose sight of what God was up to. And they began to ask the question that many of you are asking this morning: is God really actually going to set all things right? And so Luke reminds them of Jesus' teaching. Luke reminds them and us that it's not into a world of peace that Christ returns, but into a world of chaos and war and distress, perplexity, fainting, and fear. It's not into a world made new that Christ enters and makes all things new. It is into a profoundly fractured and broken place that Christ enters and makes all things new. And does this not accurately describe our world? one where there's no shortage of conflict, no shortage of distress, no shortage of anxiety about what in the world is going to happen to our climate, to our country, to our world, to our lives. And it's in this context that Jesus says, and from that point, from that place, you will see the Son of Man riding in on the clouds in power and in glory. And he tells us in verse 28, when these things take place, straighten up, lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Jesus teaches us to see our great need, to see our distress, our anxiety as a sign that our redemption is not here yet, but is on its way. This means that while Advent begins in the dark, it does not leave us in the dark. Because Advent is, after all, about hope. Jesus' teaching of the world of gloom and doom, our own dissatisfaction and pain and suffering, remind us that the world is not the way that it ought to be yet. And we can ignore that dissatisfaction, or we can be curious about it. So, I know for many of us who grew up in certain circles, like the one that I did, where we heard this passage as a fear passage, one where one day blink and half the planet's going to disappear, and so you better believe in Jesus so you can go with them and escape all of these things. You've changed your theology since then. But if I can be honest with you, in love, what I fear is that what many of you have embraced is you've ignored passages like this, and you've begun to embrace some sort of idea that the way that Jesus is going to make the world new again is by just gradually things will just get a little bit better. We'll just work a little bit harder. We'll vote a little bit better next time. We'll put this policy in place instead of that policy. We'll pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and we will get serious about doing the work of Jesus. And gradually the kingdom of God will break in upon us. But what happens when we start to take Jesus seriously about this? When we start to take Jesus seriously about the Son of Man riding in on clouds. When we really see that our longings are nothing more than signposts. That ache that you have inside of you is pointing to something that ought to be here and is not. A future day of peace. What I think can happen is that Christ can take all of these things and he can transfigure them. He can remake them. He can take that ache that's pointing towards this future day, and he can take our dissatisfaction, he can take our disappointment, and he can transfigure it into hope. Because Jesus reminds us that God has not abandoned us, that God is here with us. And I want to tell you, friend, in whatever it is that you are carrying today, maybe you had a great Black Friday haul and you're coming in here riding on clouds. Or maybe you look like you got in a fight with someone, Christine. But when what actually happened was far less dramatic and exciting, I got into a fight with the sidewalk and the sidewalk won. Whatever grief, whatever disappointment, whatever dissatisfaction, whatever pain, even when you think you don't have it, even when you feel like you're flying high, even when it feels like life is great, there's still that thing deep, deep down in us. I want you to know that God has not abandoned you. Jesus' words put the difficult situation that we're in a cosmic context. And we're situated in the midst of this turmoil, this tension between good and evil, between the kingdom that is breaking in but is not yet fully here, and the world that was, the old creation, the one that the New Testament tells us is lorded over by Satan, the lion who seeks to steal, kill, and devour. Because God has not abandoned us, we believe that God has joined God's self to us. This is what Christmas is. Christmas is God's commitment to so join and unite your destiny with his, your fate with his, your outcome with his, that all of our despair, all of our grief suddenly becomes his despair, his grief. All of our aching and hopes and dreams for the future are his aching hopes and dreams for the future. And we can rest assured that the God who died and was resurrected will resurrect this world as well. And so all of that angst, that grief, that despair can be used by God and turned into something that looks a lot like hope. I also want to note that I think that Jesus points our hope in the right direction. So we've got a educated, largely upwardly mobile group of folks here. And I think for many of us, we have a lot in our lives that we worked really hard for. So I came across an article, an essay in the New Yorker, which I find myself reading from time to time. Just kidding, I don't. I never read the New Yorker. But I stumbled on this and I was fascinated. I couldn't stop reading. And it was by a guy named Joshua Rothman titled, "Should I Just Give Up?" In it, Rothman is surveying Oliver Burkeman's book, Meditation for Mortals, and he writes this: "Many of us aspire to command our lives as though we were the captain of a super yacht, controlling our route from the plush leather swivel chair on the serene and silent bridge." I can't help but acknowledge that so much of this is true for us, for me. And I get so angry when anything comes in and disrupts that charade. We think that we are the masters of our fate, the captain of our souls, to quote the poem. And then suddenly we get cancer. We get divorced. We lose someone in our life that we were never supposed to lose. Piercing loneliness and isolation absolutely and utterly overwhelm us. What I think he gets right here is that there is deeply embedded in our American imagination a lie that you are in control of so much of your life. Rothman, partially quoting Berkman again, says that we aspire to live lives like captains of a super yacht, but he goes on to say, yet it's more realistic to see each of us as occupying a little one-person kayak out in the middle of the open ocean, tossed by waves and borne along on the river of time towards death. "Nothing can save us that is possible," wrote the poet Auden. His famous Christmas Oratio captures the heart of the matter. "We who must die demand a miracle." You see, Advent is not about, here's 3 ways to have a cheerful season. Here's 5 ways to invite Christ into your home this year. The major point here is that we so desperately need help from outside. We need something outside of us to save us. That our ingenuity, our cleverness, our imaginations are not enough. When Christ returns and ushers in the final culmination of God's kingdom here on earth, that is the new creation in full, when heaven and earth are fully joined together, the point is that it will not be because of our hard work. It won't be because you got it right and everyone else got it wrong. We do not need to do something to usher in peace on earth. We do not need to do something to assure our place in God's new world. Each one of these is God's work, not ours. And there are lots of opportunities to join it, absolutely. But our hope is that God will burst in like the dawn. And what this does, the final point here this morning, is that a hope like this it's very deep, tinged with pain, awake to what the world actually is, will absolutely transform the way that we go about our lives. So listen to Jesus again in verse 34. Be on your guard so that your hearts will not be weighed down with the dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life. And that this day will not come on you suddenly like a trap, for it will come upon all those who live on the face of the earth. But stay alert at all times, praying that you will have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. And so I go back to Brueggemann's definition, the second part. He says, hope is subversive. It limits the grandiose pretension of the present, daring to announce that the present to which we've all made commitments is now called into question. See, the thing that makes Jesus' arrival, the peace on earth, so frightening is the question of, wait, what is he going to ask me to give up? What is he going to ask me to let go of? What is it that I think that I want to give me life that's probably not giving me life, but I just don't want to give it up yet, that he might say no to? And so our true hope is not about getting over your dissatisfaction and looking on the bright side. It's not about somehow limiting your suffering, but instead carrying these things into the presence of the God who promises to make all things new. And to live a life of expectation and anticipation, of watchfulness. To really allow it to seep down into your heart and soul that what is now is not what will be. I know that's hard. But it means practically that we fully understand and grasp that our peace cannot be bought by cheap Black Friday deals. And anytime I say something like that, I can't help but hear the quote from, if y'all seen that movie, Orange County. Mom, money can't buy happiness. Oh, grow up. Yes, it can. It's a great line. And even though we know it's true on paper, like true, false, can money buy happiness? And we can check the box. We find ourselves this time of year with a deep longing and ache in our souls, filling up our carts with deals that even just in this moment make us feel a little bit better, a little bit more distracted. Or maybe we sit on the couch and we watch a Christmas movie. None of these things are wrong, by the way. I went to church and they told me Christmas movies were of the devil. No, not the message this morning. But what we're so good at, what the world out there is so good at this time of year, is with all the tinsel and all the cheer and all the great deals, trying to make you think that peace on earth has arrived. Or at least it's just a click away. What Jesus invites us to, what Advent invites us to, is back to that longing and ache that we have deep inside of us. This is so often the shape that our hope takes. And so nothing can save us that is possible. We cannot expect any sort of lasting peace or comfort from the world, not if Jesus is right. No, if Jesus is right, our consolation is not some slow march towards progress, an evolution of our morals and manners and policy, but something that comes bursting in from outside of us. A peace that races in a burst of transcendent power, as Fleming Rutledge writes, breaking upon us all at once from somewhere outside of this closed system we call the universe. We who must die demand a miracle. Nothing natural is going to undo all this death. And so, Redemption Church, hear the announcement of our Lord this morning. God will come bursting in. And his justice will wash over all things. And God will put an end once and for all to all evil and suffering and death in all of its form. And Christ will dry every single one of your tears. And there will be an overflowing of abundance and peace. Wholeness and delight and love and joy, the likes of which we only get glimpses of here and now in this moment in this life. And so until then, Jesus says, lift your head, for your redemption draws near.